Recovery is stupendous.
Achievable.
Hope.
Freedom.
Empowering.
It's unique to everyone.
It's a journey, not a destination.
Getting a new lease on life.
It's finding restoration after you fall down.
Recovery is having the freedom to enjoy life.
For me, it was finding a way to really love myself.
My recovery is possible in part because of my own sense of purpose.
Welcome to Montana's Peer Network Recovery Talks podcast. I'm Jim Haney.
And I'm Andy Daniel.
Thanks so much for tuning in to another episode. Today, Andy and I are going to be talking about advocacy.
Yeah, we've got a legislative session coming up, but we just want to talk about advocacy in general and what that means and how we can affect change in the recovery movement.
Exactly. Yeah, our timing, we had thought about this and thought, boy, this would be great for December, because come January 4th in Montana, we have our legislative session. And we'll talk a little bit about that a little further in the podcast. But I guess just to start it out, advocacy and what does that mean in the recovery movement? And I think that when I hear the word advocacy, the very next thing that I think about is change. It's like the very next kind of word that sort of pops in my head, change. And I guess my frame, it comes from how can we improve it? How can we improve things? How can we evolve? We learn new things. We're in a COVID time. We've gone virtual. It's different. It's changing. It's ever changing, whether you're in COVID or not, right? Like, how do we advocate for change within the system? I think that's sort of my initial thoughts. What about you? What are some of your initial thoughts?
I think of it as sort of an empowering kind of thing, that if you don't like the way things are, there are things you can do to change those things. If you don't like the services that you've received or the way something functions, you can work to change that. It might take a while.
Right.
A lot of times this doesn't happen immediately. But it's really empowering to know that you can affect services or the system to help other people not have a negative experience if that's what you had.
Right. No, that makes perfect sense. And I think in doing that, in creating these change, a better experience, right? It's not just better for the next person, it's better for the next 100 people or 1,000 people. Like, it's like the ripple effect is enormous because it continues on when you change something for the better. I think about the work that Montana's Peer Network, did around peer support, and specifically about things like funding. Mm-hmm. So somebody was just telling me about they were talking to peer supporters in another state where they have certification, they have Medicaid, but they only reimburse like $2 every 15 minutes or something. and ours is like $15. Like, they were like, what? Like $2, like 15, like what? Like, no, like, right? Like, no, you mean an hour, $15 for an hour. No, every 15 minutes, right? And these are the kinds of things, right? And this type of change that didn't exist before, I guess is where I'm kind of going with this, is that didn't exist. The funding wasn't available. And if that funding's not available, then service providers don't hire the peer supporters because they can't pay for them.
Yep.
The individual peer supporter doesn't have the job, right? I mean, there's this whole sort of sequence of things then that happen. And of course, on the going the other direction, there's clients who receive the services. And because you have these peer supporters in there with these lived experiences, they impact the treatment people receive, the services, hopefully in a positive way, by understanding, hey, there's someone else who's gone through this. But there's like this whole little chain that kind of happens, and that kind of change is exciting and it's long lasting. The impact is enormous. It's not just this year, it's next year and the year after, and until someone else changes it, till someone gets tired of the way you doing it, and then they speak up and change it one more time.
And I feel like they build, and it becomes easier. Each successive change becomes a little bit easier. I mean, if you look at like certification, right? It took several sessions of the legislature before certification happened, before
Right.
that got passed. But then there wasn't that much time between that and Medicaid reimbursement, right?
Right.
It's not like you had to wait another 6 years or whatever for that to happen. Once you get that ball rolling,
Yeah.
and people can see that it's beneficial, or things have changed for the better, then it makes successive changes easier.
Agreed. Yeah. I think another important part of advocacy that you have to think about, and the impact, is personally having a voice, finding your voice. When you're early in recovery, most of us, our self-esteem is pretty low. We don't feel like we have anything meaningful to contribute. We might not be that well connected to our communities or even society. I mean, you might even be disconnected from society, and so getting involved with things like in Montana, the local advisory councils, but there's other groups too. I mean, there's like here in Livingston, there's like Live Well 49. These are other sort of wellness groups that are doing really good work, and finding a voice and recognizing your lived experience, mental health, substance use, trauma, whatever it may be, has a place at the table. Your voice has a place, and that when you can begin to speak up and learn to use that voice, it's super empowering, like you said, but it's just the awareness that there's a place for you at the table that's important. We need to hear that voice, and it can't be overshadowed by the system sort of people, providers, law enforcement, commissioners, that kind of thing, to actually be able to say, well, I don't know, I use the services and this was my experience. Have people listen and think about what you're sharing, and have that begin to impact. I think in a person's recovery, when you find that voice, it's like a leap forward. You make this big stride, and then you get all those wonderful things because you feel better about yourself, your self-esteem goes up, and yeah.
Yeah, and it can be really intimidating to start that process, I think. For instance, joining a local advisory council, right? It actually took me a lot of thought, and I sort of had to work up to, I should go to that meeting. I actually felt like I needed to find somebody to go to the meeting with me so that I wasn't quite as uncomfortable. And so, I started that way, and in 2 months was the chair. So things moved really, really fast. But I think that, we started this peer advocacy and leadership project, and part of that is to help people get over that feeling of intimidation or being uncomfortable in that role, and really to focus on how the voice of people in recovery is so important in these different groups that are often full of providers or professionals, that kind of thing, who just don't really have the same grasp that
Right.
We do as people in recovery.
Agreed. Yeah. And I mentioned this in the beginning. We're in COVID times, and just think about how services have changed just in the last 9 months everywhere. I mean, you're not driving up to your counselor's office and going upstairs and sitting in the waiting room till the person before you is done, and then you're going in next, and right. And you're probably not going to that many support group meetings. And I mean, it's completely changed. And so, I think about okay, what about this conversation? Like, this is the next level of conversation to begin having. So how do we provide these services, counseling services as an example, peer support services, in a COVID world? Is it Zoom, whatever, Google, whatever, like whatever Teams or whatever your thing is, or is it on the phone? Are we texting people? And can the system, change and make that change? And I think, I see some parts of the system are, and some aren't, and some are having trouble making that shift.
What I find interesting though is that a lot of times you'll have the system or provider say, no, we can't do that. And COVID is a terrible thing and is incredibly disruptive, but it has also pushed those things to happen, right?
Yes.
Telehealth has ebbed and flowed depending on where you are and stuff. And this really pushed it as,
yes,
we have to do something. You can't just leave people with nothing. And so sometimes it takes that massive outside force to push something in the right direction.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Pre-COVID, the big question, I know, like SAMHSA asks this all the time. So how do you deliver peer services in frontier Montana? A third of our state is like frontier, right? Like like there aren't any people. How do you do that? You don't have counselor offices on every corner, and right? You're making a really good point there. Now that we're all much more familiar with video meetings, groups, can we hold on to this after COVID and provide services to those very rural and frontier communities where there aren't a lot of people are very spread out? Because that's been an issue, right? We hear this all the time. Farmers and ranchers, suicide rates are higher, rates of depression, alcoholism, those kinds of things. We've been saying this as advocates for a while, technology, but you're right. It's sort of, telemedicine is sort of ebbed and flowed. Some places did it and figured out how to do it well. Other places tried it and it didn't work so well. And now we're seeing how simplistic it is. I mean, we're having these meetings. My gosh, I don't know how many times a week I'm on a virtual meeting with video and with lots of people. I mean, there are days where I'm on easily 5 meetings in one day. So let's say I average 3 a day, 5 days a week. I mean, it's right. And so maybe that's one of the changes.
And I think then that can lead you into advocating to continue these services even after COVID has settled down, right? And maybe we don't absolutely need to do counseling over Zoom forever for everybody. But now we've got some evidence that says we can be effective over video or over the phone or whatever. And I think that really makes it easier for peer supporters in smaller communities because, there might not be enough, you might not have enough peers in like Glasgow to be a full-time peer supporter, but maybe in, the northeast corner of Montana, you can. And so I think it really opens it up and gives you the opportunity to say, hey, we did this for a year and it worked.
2 years.
2 years. Who knows? We can keep doing this, right?
Yeah. Yes, exactly. Yeah. And those are the kinds of things that someone might choose to be an advocate for. I mean, you could be an advocate for anything. I mean, we focus specifically here on recovery and peer support, behavioral health issues. And that kind of leads us into, in about a month from now, January 4th, we're going to go into the 2021 legislative session in Montana. And this is a great place to get some experience being an advocate. Now, we don't know what sort of precautions are going to be in place with COVID. So going in like the way a normal session sort of operates, talking about that, there's hearings, there's committee hearings, and, people can go and they can advocate for something. You could be against something, or you can be informational, where you just provide kind of information about a particular topic, or like for us, our lived experience. And so there's these hearings you can go to, these committee hearings, and they're all online. And in fact, they make it really easy. You can actually sign up for which committees you want to know about, and you can not only watch them from home, listen to them if you prefer, but they have the email addresses of the legislators on that committee. You can send an email to the entire committee. There's a book, like a index, a directory. There's their phone numbers, there's their personal emails. And of course, you can always go in person and testify at one of these committees. And the website for the upcoming session is leg.mt.gov/session. If you can also just Google 2021 Montana legislative session, it comes right up. They've actually got a counter that's counting down the days, and it's already up. They've got all these nice tabs at the top. And then once you find a bill that you want to advocate for, you can just use the little drop-down menu. You can look it up, and you can always see the status of it, like where it is in committee. It's very user-friendly, I think, this site. You're familiar with this site, Andy?
Yeah. I've used it a lot to track things that I'm interested in, not just in the recovery movement, but for other things that affect me or my local area. And I know during the last session, the legislators from my area had weekly video calls anyway, where you could go to the courthouse and they had it set up so that you could talk to your legislators. They could give you an update. I imagine that's going to look different this year.
Sure.
I would guess that it's going to be more like you can do it from home, right? They'll just get on a Zoom or whatever, and you'll just do it from home instead of having to go to the courthouse. But I don't think people knew that existed, right? I had a personal connection to a legislator. And so that's how I found out most of my information, is because, I personally knew this person pretty well. The other thing that is really cool this year on the legislature's website is that they've been training the new legislators through video conference, and they've recorded all of them. So you can actually go in and watch the training sessions and watch a mock session and that kind of thing. And so I feel like, that's a wonderful opportunity to actually see what it looks like before you go and testify, right? Most of us don't have any idea what that looks like when you go testify.
It's intimidating. I can remember 2009 was the first year that I got involved with advocacy at that level. And I say that level because it really is a whole nother level. I mean, it's, your legislators are dressed in business attire, and the expectation is, you should look presentable and nice, and, it's all very orderly. And I remember the first, I don't think I'll ever forget. I mean, the first hearing that I went to, you got to get up, I live far away, like you, we live far away from Helena. So if you're going to make a 9 o'clock hearing, you got to get up at like 4 a.m. and, so anyway, I remember getting there, and the line to testify was through the room, out the door, into the hall. And I think the first hearing I think there were more than 70 people testifying. And I just remember, you sign up on this clipboard and it asks you, your name and your address and for, against, informational, which one, you check the boxes. But I mean, it was long. It was like an hour and a half of like waiting, and you're listening to the testimony, and then somebody sort of says something like, oh, that's what I was going to say, like, and you're at the state capitol, which that's a whole nother thing. The state capitol is a beautiful building. And so anyway, it just, I remember the longer I sat there, the more nervous I got, because you're just listening to these people and there's some big people who go up there and testify and oh my gosh, I mean, it was just, and then I'll fast forward to 2017 when we brought the bill for certification, that wasn't our first rodeo. Anyway, and we're sitting there and I'm sitting in, I think I was in the second row. So okay, we're going to start testimony, and I sort of like looked around and everyone was looking at me, wanting me to go first. and that was like a whole different level of intimidation. There was no one to warm up the committee. And I thought, well, everybody's looking at me. And they're like, I think it was Joel was sitting next to me and he starts, elbowing me, they're waiting for you. Like, and it's like, oh my gosh, I'm the first person, not 70th, and so how things change. And the more times you do it and you get more comfortable, and even just getting around the Capitol, where the rooms are, there's so many rooms and there's different levels. And anyway, the more times, I've done it, the more comfortable I get, but I still get super nervous. But yeah, you kind of go up there and just speak from the heart and say kind of what you mean, and then hope they don't ask you questions later, because sometimes they do that afterwards. They're like, where's that guy who went first? Bring him back up here. We're gonna ask him some questions, and then you're really on the spot. And there's cameras and microphones and, but it's a neat experience. It really is. And for a person in recovery, to be able to go and share your views, your voice, your life experience, provide education to people. I really do encourage folks to take a look, find something. And like you said, maybe it's not even about recovery. Maybe it's something else in your area that you're interested in, but follow it, and go and get involved. And in a state like Montana, I'm a transplant, right? I mean, I've been here 20 years now, but I didn't grow up here. I mean, I grew up in Chicago. I couldn't do that in Chicago. That's not accessible to you. And it's not accessible, not because they don't have testimony. It's because there's 100,000 people in the 70 line, right? So it's not accessible. Here, it's accessible. You can talk to your legislators. You can, you know what I mean? Like in the hallways, and you can email them and they respond. And it's really, it's, American democracy in action. And, you have a place at the table.
And I feel like in places like Montana, your legislators are much more involved in your communities, right? Because this is not their job. Yeah. It's a few months every 2 years. So they have to be more connected to the communities than some of the larger
I agree.
cities.
Yeah, I agree. I totally agree. I remember, so going way back, it might have been 2009, might have been my first session or my second session. I can't remember, but I remember being introduced on the Senate floor. That gave me goosebumps. That gave me goosebumps. I mean, they like, you stand up and they introduce you, and then the whole Senate like stands up and gives you like a, round of applause kind of thing. And the speaker says, welcome to the Senate, or welcome to the House. And I mean, it gives you goosebumps. I mean, you're like, whoa, like, it's a neat experience. And your legislator will do that. You talk to them, tell them, you're coming. Now, again, I don't know what's going to happen in COVID, COVID year. I don't know if they're going to do all that stuff, or we don't know if there's going to be public testimony the same. I mean, I don't know. They can't put all these people in a room. So we'll have to see what the rules are going to be But nonetheless, you can always email, you can always call, and you can always just listen in. I mean, you can watch, there's video cameras, you can watch the committee, you can watch the testimony, you can listen to it. And even that's important, and find a couple other peers and go together and go to your state capitol. You got a 3-month window coming up here. And then MPN will try to keep you up to date with, the relevant recovery-oriented bills that you might want to follow, the happenings. And if you're members, we need you. We need you to speak up. There's funding and policies and all kinds of things that are on the table. So think about being an advocate, and also consider our PAL, project, the Peer Advocacy and Leadership Project. Andy talked about this. We have a bunch of trainings, can help you navigate this, learn some skills, because we need all the peer leaders we can get.
Yeah, it's a series of 6 trainings. We've talked about it on other podcasts before, but we're actually going to do all 6 of them in January and February. So you can get all 6 of those out of the way in the first 2 months of next year. Other than that, we rotate 1 or 2 a month usually, but we're going to try to get as many in January and February as we can.
Yeah. So check it out. Go to our website, mtpeernetwork.org. It's called the PAL Project, PAL, Peer Advocacy and Leadership Training. Has all the trainings. You can register right there. Andy does a great job setting it up. It's very user-friendly. And then you'll hear one of our voices. You'll get on one of the trainings, and it'll be one of us on there, and they're always really good. We have good conversation, and everybody learns a lot and shares their experiences, and just get you some skills and some education and background to be a good advocate.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I think that about wraps up our advocacy podcast. Listeners, we thank you so much for tuning in. And if you would like to be a guest, if you have a topic you want us to talk about, you can email us. My email is jim@mtpeernetwork.org.
And mine is Andy, ANDI, @mtpeernetwork.org.
And let us know if you want to hear something, and keep tuning in to Recovery Talks. Thanks so much.
Bye-bye.
Recovery works and recovery is possible.
Recovery works and recovery is possible.
Recovery works, recovery is possible.
Recovery is possible.
Recovery works and recovery is possible.
Recovery works and recovery is possible.
Recovery works and recovery is possible.